Greetings, everyone. Alarm bells are ringing across Russia as the war reaches a turning point. Ladies and gentlemen, the world is witnessing unprecedented upheavals. From the fields of Ukraine to the blazing Strait of Hormuz, the balance of power is being dramatically overturned. Are we approaching the end of some of the most persistent confrontations of the 21st century? The alarm bells are ringing relentlessly across Russian territory, marking a grim and dramatic turning point in the conflict. For the first time since the fighting began, the situation has shifted dramatically. Ukraine is striking Russia's rear even harder than they've been hit themselves. Continuous drone attacks have shattered the illusion of the superiority of the Russian war machine, leaving geopolitical observers astonished at the rise of a new power. This past March was the moment when this strategic shift was established, as the number of Ukrainian drones crossing the border officially surpassed the scale of attacks by their opponent. This is not simply a symbolic victory in a war of attrition, but a calculated strategic move, directly targeting Russia's economic and military lifelines, from oil and gas infrastructure to logistics depots and defense complexes. The newly released statistics have painted a vivid picture of contrast. In just 1 week, while Moscow launched more than 2,800 aerial devices toward Ukraine, Kyiv responded with 2,300 of its own. However, this number only accounts for targets at key oil and gas export infrastructure in the northwest. In reality, countless other drones simultaneously attacked Russian facilities in the south, east, and even the central interior regions. The most notable was the large-scale raid on the two strategic ports, Primos and UST Luga, on March 30th, involving about 200 drones coordinating smoothly to paralyze the enemy's air defense system. The change in scale becomes even more apparent when looking at the overall picture. Russia claims to have intercepted 7,347 Ukrainian drones in March, averaging 237 drones destroyed per day, the highest number ever recorded. On the other hand, Ukraine also had to face 6,406 drones and 138 missiles from Russia, with a successful interception rate of up to 90% for drones and nearly 3/4 for missiles. The one-sided balance has been shattered. Now, Ukraine is not only able to defend itself, but also has enough strength to project power deep into the opponent's territory. This change comes after years of steady investment, and Ukraine is now set to benefit. Ukraine is expanding long-range strikes and optimizing mid-range operations, targeting logistics centers, command posts, and air defense locations, 20 to 300 kilometers behind the front lines. Right in the heart of Russia, this change has created a wave of deep concern. Military analysts in Moscow have begun to harshly criticize not only Ukraine's rising capabilities, but also the fundamental differences in organizational thinking. They praise Kyiv's model of military development based on innovation and decentralization. Under the new leadership, Ukrainian units and manufacturers can independently upgrade systems and integrate new navigation tools and sensors within just a few weeks instead of years. In fact, the cycle from the initial idea to actual combat deployment has been shortened to a record 30 days. On the other hand, Russian observers bitterly admit that their system is paralyzed by heavy bureaucracy. Every minor improvement has to go through a maze of approval procedures and lengthy inspections, making innovations either too late or completely useless by the time they reach the battlefield. This rigidity is stifling Russia's ability to adapt, even with simple tasks like upgrading aircraft or integrating new weapons. Meanwhile, Ukraine is constantly experimenting and deploying at a rapid pace, creating an ever-widening gap in technology and mindset. Behind this revolution is a defense industry that is surging. In 2025 alone, Ukraine spent more than $95 billion USD on security and defense, accounting for up to 43% of its gross domestic product. Currently, Ukraine produces more than 200 long-range drones every day at a much lower cost than Russia. However, it is the extensive international cooperation with joint production projects in Germany and France that promises to push output to hundreds of units each month. The combination of creative internal strength and international support has turned Ukraine into a global leader in autonomous unmanned warfare, meeting more than half of its military needs and gradually reducing dependence on external sources. The Russian parliament is urging Putin to end the war before it is too late. The last opportunity is gradually closing as the Russian parliament begins to put pressure on President Putin to end the war before things get out of control. Russia is facing an extremely difficult survival challenge as Ukraine's repeated long-range strikes have exposed a deadly Achilles heel. Russia's air defense system is running dangerously low on interceptor missiles, forcing commanders to begin implementing austerity measures, rationing each missile to survive. The prospect of a complete collapse of the multi-layered defensive network is no longer a distant hypothesis, but is gradually becoming a harsh reality. It directly threatens critical infrastructure, military bases, and even major cities that were once considered invulnerable. They are now vulnerable to relentless waves of attacks the Russian military can't stop. The crisis is most intense in the Crimean Peninsula, where tensions have peaked. The desperate cries for help from air defense units in Sevastopol sent to the Ministry of Defense have painted a grim picture. The soldiers could only stand by and watch as Ukrainian drones advanced, without a single missile to intercept them. In their desperation, they even had to use light infantry weapons to fire back at modern flying devices, a painful testament to the exhaustion of national defense resources. The cause lies not only on the battlefield, but also in the deep wounds within the industrial sector. Strategic repair facilities like the Granite Innovation Center in Sevastopol have been severely damaged in a raid, while the Western sanctions clampdown, especially Germany's efforts to dismantle smuggling networks for microelectronic components, have choked modern production lines. When production cannot keep up with the rate of consumption, Russia's strategic reserves are gradually becoming empty, leading to the systematic collapse of the Zadar network and jamming stations in Crimea. Desperation is spreading throughout Russian territory as they are forced to bring out old Trela 10 systems from 80 years ago, which have a range of only 5 kilometers and were never designed to counter modern drone swarms. In Orion, people have even seen improvised air defense systems where air-to-air missiles are crudely mounted on the backs of trucks to compensate for the vast gaps in the protective fire network. Missiles are now sent directly to the front lines right after production, showing Russia has no reserves left. To fill the gap, Moscow has been forced to mobilize its air force to intercept drones, but the cost is enormous. In just a few days, the list of destroyed equipment has grown with names like the K-27 helicopter over the Black Sea, the Su-30 fighter jet, the An-26 transport plane, and the Su-34 attack aircraft. All were lost attempting defensive missions beyond their abilities, further weakening the already overstretched air combat capacity. Amid the bleak picture of shortages and losses, a stark and ironic contrast has emerged. While frontline units and civilian facilities were left unprotected, the president's residence at Valdai was surrounded by a solid steel shell, with 27 Panzer systems mounted on high towers, forming strong protective circles. This disparity not only reveals the stark differences in the Kremlin's defense strategies, but also exposes the extreme anxiety of the leadership. At the same time, old air defense systems began appearing at other critical infrastructure sites, set up solely to deceive reconnaissance equipment and make Ukraine hesitate. However, these camouflage measures can hardly conceal the reality that Russia's air defense strength is being eroded day by day, pushing the country into its deepest crisis of confidence and strategy since the war began. Iranians rejected the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps after the government made concessions to the U.S. The geopolitical game in the Middle East has just witnessed a stunning reversal as Iran decided to make a complete retreat just 4 days after enduring a suffocating blockade from the United States. A shocking statement was made. Tehran not only agreed to reopen the Strait of Hormuz, but also to terminate its nuclear program and pledged to return all enriched uranium. If this information is verified, this is truly an unconditional surrender, a tragic and astonishingly swift end for a force that once declared itself tough in the region. This surrender was like a cold shower for Iran's supporters, causing public opinion at home to boil over and turn to criticize their own government as they bitterly realized the nation's position had completely collapsed on the chessboard of power. In that context, President Trump quickly made triumphant statements, affirming that the Strait of Hormuz was now clear and ready for trade activities. Although there were a few minor naming errors in the documents, the core message was unshakable under U.S. control. Iran is now urgently removing naval mines to return these vital shipping lanes to the world, just like before the flames of war broke out. However, a fog of uncertainty about the truth began to settle in when a statement from Iran's Ministry of Foreign Affairs presented a completely opposite view. According to Tehran, the opening of the strait is only temporary, tied to the ceasefire agreement in Lebanon, and will end in about 5 days. They also emphasize that ships are only allowed to follow specific coordinated routes behind islands like Lozak or Qasim, instead of the usual international routes. So who is really lying in this tense battle of wits? The answer lies right on online maritime maps. In reality, a very different scenario was revealed. A Greek ship carrying 2 million barrels of crude oil boldly crossed the heart of the Strait of Hormuz, using the old route, despite turning off its positioning device. Even a cruise ship leaving Dubai port crossed the strait on the main route with its positioning device brightly lit for the whole world to see, proving that they did not need to follow any of the restricted coordinated routes set by Iran. This shows that Tehran's statements were likely just a desperate effort,
nhằm giữ lại chút thể diện cuối cùng.
when in reality the strait is completely beyond their control. The root of this concession is the economic stranglehold called the blockade. 90% of Iran's economy and trade depends entirely on the sea. For the past 4 days, the United States Central Command has established an impenetrable steel wall, preventing any ship from entering or leaving Iran's ports. As Napoleon once summed up, to win a war, you need 3 things: money, money, and a lot of money. When the flow of money is cut off, Iran has no choice but to sit at the negotiating table from a much weaker position. The oil market immediately reacted positively to this news. Oil prices plummeted from the $90 mark down to about $83 per barrel. An ironic detail is that even though Iran has made concessions, the U.S. blockade of the country's seaports is still ongoing, showing that Washington has not relaxed its control. The Pentagon has sent a strong message to the Iranian military leadership and the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps, stating that this is not a fair fight. While Iran is struggling to salvage what remains of its devastated infrastructure, the United States is growing stronger every day with an intelligence network sharper than ever. Every movement, every shift of Tehran's military assets is under strict surveillance. Washington asserts that they are ready to launch attacks on critical energy infrastructure and power grids if Iran takes any retaliatory action. The statistics have demonstrated the devastating effectiveness of the blockade. 14 ships that tried to break through have all failed miserably. An audio recording from the U.S. warship number 115 captured the moment they ordered the Iranian ship Blue Sky 4 to turn back to its previous port in frustration. The brief, decisive commands on Channel 16 were a clear assertion of absolute authority at sea. At the end of this dramatic episode, President Trump affirmed that Iran had agreed to never again use the Strait of Hormuz as a weapon to threaten the world. Although the authenticity of this long-term commitment remains in question, there is one undeniable fact. The current Iranian regime has almost exhausted all its bargaining chips on the global geopolitical chessboard. If the leadership in Tehran truly feels that they are once again facing an existential crisis, I believe they will not hesitate to play their last and only card. That is, attacking the Gulf countries and completely blockading the strait. However, the tragedy for Iran lies in the fact that with each passing day, their power over the Strait of Hormuz is gradually eroding in the long term. The Gulf countries now fully understand the costs of dependence. They understand that Iran is willing to carry out acts of economic terrorism, targeting even countries that are not involved in the conflict, just to maintain its power. That is why efforts to diversify shipping routes are stronger than ever, to escape the grip of Hormuz. Saudi Arabia has redirected about 40% of its crude oil through a transnational pipeline system that leads directly to the Red Sea. The United Arab Emirates is quickly developing projects to transport oil via pipelines that bypass the Strait of Hormuz, enabling direct loading at the Gulf of Oman. Iraq is also drawing up plans for a super pipeline through the Middle East to Europe. Although it is known that these major projects cannot be completed overnight, in the long run, when the world becomes less dependent on Hormuz,
Iran sẽ vĩnh viễn mất đi công cụ gây áp lực hiệu quả nhất của mình.
The concerns of Iran's leaders are not just limited to outside their borders. They are facing a tsunami of criticism within the country itself after the statement about the Strait of Hormuz. On pro-government social media channels and Telegram, the atmosphere is more chaotic than ever. The Iranian people feel betrayed and utterly humiliated. Painful questions are being raised. What about the blood and sacrifices of the martyrs and the dozens of high-ranking generals who have fallen? If in the end the strait has to be opened so easily, then what is the meaning of those sacrifices? Public opinion in Iran is boiling over the government's ambiguity. They can't understand why the country gave up all its bargaining advantages so quickly. The authorities' confusion in explaining what is actually happening only adds to the public's anger. But with the crisis in the strait, another strategic card is also being weighed: the stockpile of enriched uranium buried deep underground in Iran. President Trump just made a dramatic statement about what he called nuclear dust that America's B-2 bombers will recover. He asserted that no money would be exchanged in any form, and this agreement is completely separate from the situation in Lebanon, even though the U.S. will still have its own way of dealing with Hezbollah. In my assessment, the nuclear dust that Mr. Trump mentioned is actually about 400 kilograms of uranium enriched to 60% stored at Isfahan and other nuclear facilities. This is a level very close to weapons grade. Depending on Iran's technology, it takes just 1 to 2 months to turn it into a nuclear bomb. Allowing this dangerous amount of material to be in Tehran's hands is a risk that Washington cannot accept, and it seems that Iran has been forced to agree to return it. However, the story about the money is still a highly controversial issue. Before Mr. Trump's statement, there were reports that the United States was considering releasing $20 billion in exchange for this uranium. It should be clarified that this is not American taxpayers' money, but rather Iranian assets that have been frozen for a long time. The negotiations are expected to continue in Islamabad at the end of this week to reach a final agreement. The United States is pressuring Iran to stop enriching uranium for 20 years, while Tehran only wants to commit for 5 years. Despite Mr. Trump assuring the media that not a single cent will be returned to Iran, I find it hard to believe that Tehran would agree to give up its nuclear treasure without receiving any lifeline in return. With an economy on the brink of collapse, regaining access to frozen funds, or having sanctions eased is the only chance for this regime to survive and rebuild after the war. The truth will only be revealed when the details of the agreement are officially announced. But clearly, a nuclear breakout by Iran is gradually becoming a reality. Can Russia turn the tide when its air defense network is completely exhausted? Or is this the beginning of an irreversible collapse from within? And in your opinion, is Iran's sudden retreat due to unbearable economic pressure? Or is it actually a covert political arrangement to protect the regime's survival?